writing this book a little over 10 years ago. And I would work on it a bit and put it down because really within the whole realm of eschatology, biblical prophecy, the issue of the harlot Babylon, identifying a harlot Babylon, Revelation 17 and 18, this is one of the most challenging, difficult, enigmatic prophecies. And I didn't want to pull the trigger on that until I thought I had clarity. And so there's been a few times that I've started writing, set it down, and finally, here we are, 2016, 17. I felt as though I had enough clarity. There's enough taking place in the earth that are making the prophecies clear that it was time to sort of lay this out on the table and let the body of Christ chew it over.
When you were writing this, did you find that you started out with one opinion and then it was reshaped along the way?
Well, essentially what I do in the book is, so the book is broken up into three parts. The first part is the exegesis, not necessarily verse by verse, but thematically. I work through the text very carefully, draw out all of the primary information that we need to identify Babylon. The second part of the book, I work through most of the primary popular interpretations. So, Rome, Jerusalem, a literal rebuilt Babylon, New York City, the United States, the Vatican, the Illuminati.
Yes.
And I begin with a chapter called The History of the Mystery. And so this is where I survey the history of Christian interpretation of this prophecy. And it's interesting, so in the early years of the church, the primary opinion of believers seemed to be that the pagan city of Rome was Mystery Babylon. Of course, they lived under the shadow, under the dominance, the hegemony of the pagan Roman Empire. But as the Roman Empire essentially fell, as pagan Rome fell and it was Christianized, then that view lost favor. And so the next major opinion that we find in history is that it was Islam. Is that Islam as a religion represented Mystery Babylon. We see that in some of the earlier commentaries that we have on Revelation. And then later, during the Reformation, the church sort of went back and picked up the idea of Rome, except now they shifted it to the Vatican. So no longer pagan Rome, but now Roman Catholic, the Roman Catholic Rome. And so this became the dominant position really for the last 500 years since the Reformation. And then over the past, let's say 150 years, many have shifted toward the Illuminati, the New World Order, this sort of thing. And now in recent years, we've had a lot of people saying the United States, Wall Street, New York City, this sort of thing. And another very popular view, which I would say of all of the interpretations, my second most favored interpretation is literal rebuilt Babylon. And so in the late 1800s, you had folks like E.W. Bullinger, J.A. Seiss, Joseph Augustus Seiss, and many of the modern dispensationalists, a lot of them coming out of Dallas, let's say Mark Hitchcock, Joel Rosenberg, some of these guys, they're looking for a rebuilt literal Babylon. But what I do is I walk through all of these different positions, I lay out their strengths, and then I work through some of their weaknesses. And because this is a, just common, rule for interpretation is, when you go to a store and you're going to buy a glove, you don't buy a glove if 3 of the 5 fingers fit, even if they fit perfectly. You buy a glove if all 5 fingers fit. So we're looking for an interpretation that doesn't have any substantial problems with the text. And that was sort of my guiding principle throughout the book.
What are some of the characteristics then of Mystery Babylon, and what guided you toward your ultimate conclusion?
Sure. Well, there's a handful of critical factors. I would say the most dominant of all of them. And it's interesting because, it's literally written across her forehead. The Lord wanted to make this as clear as possible. It's mystery, actually mystery, let's say, colon. This is a mystery. It's not Mystery Babylon. It's Mystery Babylon the Great, comma, the mother of all harlots. And these are appositional statements. In other words, they're essentially synonyms. Babylon the Great and the mother of all, they both mean the same thing. She is the biggest, the greatest, the most, in terms of just quantitative, she is the biggest of all harlots. Harlotry is false religion. It's idolatry. It's very simple. So above anything, she is the greatest, most significant false religion the world has ever known. But throughout the prophecy, she is also not just the spiritual, but also the financial womb, the financial source of this great false religion, and she is the primary entity that is responsible for the shed blood of God's holy people, both the Jews and the Christians. And so these are some of the primary markers that we're then looking at and weighing against some of the other interpretive options.
And she's also referred to as a city.
Yes.
So how can she be a spiritual entity and a city at the same time?
Well, I mean, you know, and this is the thing, is Babylon is the prototype. This is the foundation. Babylon the city was a city of idolatry. It was a great seductive city. You know, it was responsible for the exile of the Jewish people, the destruction of Jerusalem and so forth. Later in the first century, the city of Rome was the new Babylon. This was the great global city of idolatry. And it was always, really down through history, it's always been Jerusalem versus Babylon, Jerusalem versus Nineveh, Jerusalem versus Rome. And so the question is today, what is the city? And it's not just a city, it is a city. It is most definitely a literal city, but it's also much more than a city. In the same way that Rome was a city, yea, an empire, in the same way that Babylon was a city, yea, an empire, we're looking for a city-state, if you will, a geopolitical, you know, it has its epicenter, but it's not strictly limited by the city. So what is the primary spiritual and financial capital of the reigning beast empire of our day, of the primary anti-Christic empire system of our day? And this was sort of the basis for coming to my final conclusion, which is, apart from all these other interpretations, I take the last part of the book, several chapters, to lay out the idea that Mystery Babylon is in fact the city of Mecca and the nation of Saudi Arabia. The primary city of idolatry, in fact, the greatest city of idolatry that mankind has ever known. And Saudi Arabia being, not only does it house Mecca, but it's also the greatest single source of financial support for the greatest antichrist religion that mankind has ever known. Both New York or London, they're missing the most essential component, which is the spiritual component. Because Mystery Babylon, the harlot Babylon, is not characterized by mere, you know, let's say something like materialism, you know, or this sort of thing. It is a canonized specific religion with, you know, specific doctrines, and it's responsible for the shed blood of the saints. So when I look at the city of Mecca, it's the greatest city of, as I said, idolatry in the earth. But what the Saudis are doing right now is they're working on creating essentially a mega city. So just to the west of Mecca is Jeddah, and they're turning that right now into what is going to be the greatest seaport in the world. That's their plan. So they want Jeddah to replace Dubai, you know, as the great sort of, you know, seaport of the whole Red Sea, the whole Middle East. And then in the north you have Medina, which is the second holiest city in Islam, and then you have another major port city. It's called King Abdullah Economic City. And they're right now in the process of building this incredibly high-speed railroad that will connect any one of these cities so you can get from one to the other within about 20 minutes. So although there are essentially 4 cities, it will become one mega city. So it will be and they're trying to make it the regional capital, again, of the port city for trade and commerce and so forth. But when you look at, okay, so how is Saudi Arabia? How does she fit as the one who corrupts the kings of the earth with her financial seduction? How is it that we can rightly say the kings of the earth have lived in luxury with her? And the bottom line is, when we look at the Saudi lobby, not to be confused with Hobby Lobby, you look at the Saudi lobby in Washington, the Wahhabi lobby, the Salafi lobby.
Yes.
This is the most vile, the most violent, the most terrorist-oriented sect or version or form of Islam that's ever existed. And the Saudi lobby is the single greatest lobby in Washington. There's no other lobby, in terms of just raw numbers, that has corrupted Washington to the degree that the Saudis had. And this is one of the reasons, we don't know what the days ahead are going to hold. This is one of the reasons why I celebrated when Hillary Clinton was defeated in the recent elections, because here was a woman, the Clintons, who had received well over $30 million directly from a single family, a single foreign government, you know, and into their foundation, etc. But not just the Clintons. You go back, there's evidence that that President Obama was funded, his Ivy League education was funded by the Saudis. There's some evidence of that.
Yeah.
The Bushes are actually worse than any of them. There's a book called The House of Bush, House of Saud. And this journalist works through very carefully all of the financial relationships that the Bush family has with the Saudis. And they've received over $1.5 billion, not 30 million, $1.5 billion through, all sorts of friendly loans and all sorts of different things with the Bushes. This goes back. And then, of course, Jimmy Carter was bailed out multiple times, good friends, in bed with the Saudis. And what are the Saudi, because these are not great philanthropists. They're not just, they really believe in the Clinton Initiative and the Clinton Foundation. They don't care so much about AIDS in Africa. They care about buying favor with Washington. And the bottom line is they got what they asked for.
Yeah.
In the case of Clinton, it's billion-dollar arms deals. In the case of Carter, it was, a former president, Nobel laureate, who becomes one of the most vehement anti-Semites in recent history, writing these just grossly propaganda works against Israel and this sort of thing. And so we're dealing with the amount of money that we're dealing with in terms of corrupting the kings of the earth, and not just presidents. But everyone knows in Washington, if you play ball with the Saudis when you're in power, when you get out, you'll get some cushy job, whether it's a consulting position or sitting on a board, a couple $100,000 a year for essentially doing nothing. And, this is why, praise God, we have people that are at least talking about cleaning out all of the lobbyists in Washington. But I believe this is one of the greatest issues that has been that has hamstrung the United States in terms of being able to wage the war effectively against radical Islam. Because whether we're dealing with ISIS, Al-Qaeda, any of these groups, they all find their ideological foundations in Saudi Arabia.
Well, the House of Saud not only controls politicians, they also control the media in many cases. They have invested heavily in television and print, and also internet sources. So they're controlling in many ways what you think.
Yeah, and even in so-called conservative media.
Yes,
Prince
exactly.
Al-Walid bin Talal was one of the wealthiest men in the world, was bragging several years ago during the uprisings in Paris, France, where Muslim teenagers were turning over cars and disrupting things, how he managed to get anchors on Fox News to change their terminology from Muslim unrest to teen unrest.
Yes.
Exactly. He's the largest shareholder in News Corp, which is the parent company for Fox News.
Right.
And I tell the story in the book when, I was on in 2011, just after the Arab Spring, I was on Fox News with Glenn Beck. And just after I was on is when he announced that he was leaving Fox News. And I can't confirm the story, but I met someone in an airport a couple years ago who says they're friends with Glenn, and who, again, this is sort of third person, and they said Glenn told me the reason he was kicked off of Fox was because of the Saudi ownership. He said that was one of the big factors. I can't confirm whether or not that's true or not, but I have little doubt. Same thing with Twitter. Al-Walid bin Talal is one of the largest shareholders of Twitter. I mean, when you control the information, why is he going for the information channels? Because he wants to control that.
That's really interesting, because all the big tech leaders are going to meet with Trump. This is airing in January, but this is December. And the one that is not going is Twitter.
That's interesting.
As of this morning, Twitter's
And you remember
not
that Twitter had scheduled maintenance during the unrest in Iran during the presidential election several years ago, and they deferred the maintenance so that they wouldn't take it offline, because Twitter was a key component in spreading the unrest and violence of Mystery Babylon, the 7 heads, 10 crowns, 7 hills. How well do those fit with this analysis?
Sure. I think it actually fits perfectly, because when you look at this beast in Revelation 17, it's a beast with 7 heads, but then, it seems to have an 8th head. It's not so much that it has a separate head, but the 7th head suffers a head wound, and then it comes back. And it refers to it as the 8th. Now, we know that when we just read it, it says 5 have been, 1 is. Now, of course, in the 1st century when Revelation was written, Rome was the 6th. It was the one that is. But then it says another one is coming after. It says that one that comes after will suffer the head wound and then come back. Now, what we see there is a final empire, because these are all empires. It's Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece. Those are the 5 that had been. Rome was the 6th. And then another empire is coming. And then it talks about it, almost an 8th empire, but it's really just a revival of the 7th empire. When we look at the biblical precedent for understanding this final empire, in Daniel 2 and Daniel 7, we have a singular empire which has 2 phases. So the legs of iron in Daniel 2, and then the feet of iron and clay, and then the 4th beast, and then the 10 horns that come up out of the beast, Daniel 7:24. These are the same empire, the 4th kingdom, the 4th beast, but they have 2 phases. Likewise, in Revelation, the 7th and the 8th, this represents a single empire that has 2 phases. It's not Rome. Because if it's Rome, then we're dealing with Rome is the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th. And there's no precedent for that in Scripture. We don't have precedent for a 3-tiered kingdom, a 3-phase kingdom. We have precedent for a 2-tiered. And so really the only empire in history that has emerged that meets the criteria, that follows the pattern of all of the previous empires, that has all of these anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist, anti-Christic characteristics, is the Empire of Islam. When we look in Revelation 13, the final beast is described as being a composite of a lion, a leopard, and a bear. Now, when we go back to Daniel 7, that is Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. So when we look at the Islamic Empire, it is in fact, just, in terms of looking at maps, it's a composite of a lion, leopard, and a bear. That doesn't align with this very Western European empire of Rome. So I'm not saying dogmatically, to be clear, that it's, Rome, we're not looking for a revived Roman Empire. I lean very strongly toward the 4th kingdom, the final kingdom, being a revived Islamic caliphate, an empire, if you will. And I believe that we're in the days right now where we're seeing the emergence of a revival of this empire that existed for roughly 1,300 years and was essentially abolished in 1923. I believe we're seeing that beast once again rise up like a phoenix out of the ashes.
How will this dovetail into what Erdogan wants to do right now? He'd like to be the leader of the new Ottoman Empire. Will Saudi Arabia, House of Saud, allow that?
Well, that's the thing, is the Turks and the Saudis are in conflict because historically the Turks controlled the area of Saudi Arabia. They controlled the Hijaz, as it's called. When the Saudis stepped into power, by the way, they were just, Bedouin tribes that took over the Arabian Peninsula and declared, oh, by the way, we're a monarchy, we're a kingdom. They just declare yourself a king, declare yourself to be a kingdom, and now you have the most privileged family in the world. But they're in conflict with the Turks because the Turks have a very long memory. The Turks long for the revival of the Ottoman Empire when they controlled the whole Middle East, and that's exactly what the Turkish President Erdogan wants to do. He wants to revive the Turkish Empire. So this is pitting Turkey and Saudi Arabia against each other. If in fact this beast revives, where did it suffer the head wound? But in Istanbul. Turkey was the head of the Islamic Empire when it suffered the head wound, if you will, when it suffered that beheading under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the founder of the modern secular Turkish Republic. And so if it revives from Turkey, and if we have a 10-nation coalition led by Turkey, then it's very natural to see that they would be in conflict with, thus, the beast turns on and devours the woman and burns her with fire. Because everyone hates the Saudis. They're in bed with America, the great Satan. And there's just, it really makes sense geopolitically.
That's interesting.
It is. Now, how would this then relate to an analysis of prophecy that would see the mortal head wound suffered by a physical, the Antichrist, capital A Antichrist, and his miraculous recovery?
Well, I allow for that, of course, and this is the nature of prophecy, is we can't be too restrictive, but looking at the precedent that these 7 empires are all empires, that it seems as though the 7th beast is likewise an empire. So if we shift it to become an individual, strictly an individual, because really what it is, it's kingdom. You can't have one without the other, right? And so it is, they all are both kingdom, as though there's one particular king within each empire that that spirit comes upon, whether it be Nebuchadnezzar or Sennacherib or Haman, or, I suppose there were a handful of various Caesars. You could say Muhammad may have been the founder of but really there's a king and a kingdom, and the Antichrist is the primary leader of that final kingdom. So could he suffer an individual head wound? Absolutely. Those two are not in conflict. But I think at least we need to see that that empire would come back as a second, because we already have that, again, precedent back in Daniel 2 and in Daniel 7. On Nimrod, one on Nimrod and one on Alexander Hislop's book, The Two Babylons. And I show how, in all likelihood, Alexander Hislop, I actually speculate that he may have been, he may have had a mental illness. I mean, which is a strong claim. I actually compare him to John Nash in the movie Is a Beautiful Mind?
Yes, A Beautiful Mind, yes.
Where he's portrayed, he's got all these newspaper clippings on and he's putting strings across, he's making all these connections. And I show that many of the connections that Hislop makes, they can't be substantiated either through logic, history, or otherwise, but through commonalities. He says, these all must clearly, how can we be in doubt? He makes this big tangled web, and he creates this whole worldview about Nimrod and Babylon and his wife, and they had all this religion, and the fact is, there is no historical basis or biblical basis for much of this. And we've built much of our eschatology around this, and so this is something that every careful student of Scripture needs to at least read through and consider and work through the implications. Well, in Revelation 17, 18, and a bit into 19, it talks about a literal city. It describes her using the metaphor of this perverse, grotesque woman. She's both a prostitute and a queen. She's bloodthirsty. She's drunk on the blood of the saints. But then the angel gives the interpretation, and this woman represents a city. And it's a very literal city, and the city is referred to as, it's a mystery, and it's referred to as Babylon the Great. And this city will be destroyed within the context of the final events that unfold right before the return of Jesus. And it's a city that is the primary spiritual and financial capital of the reigning system of the Antichrist. And so this has intrigued and puzzled commentators and scholars down through history as to what city, where are we looking to find the correct interpretation, the right identification of this last days Babylon. Well, this is interesting because the woman is portrayed as riding the beast. So when we initially are introduced to the harlot, this city, it is in relationship with the beast. But then the beast turns on, devours, and burns the woman. This is intended to be shocking. It's intended to be dramatically ironic. I mean, not just ironic, but shocking. They are partners. They're both dressed in scarlet. They're both all red. One's a scarlet beast. She's dressed in scarlet. And they are rider and steed. So I liken this to, I go, imagine a little kid, little Jimmy. He's got his little cap guns and his little hat, and he's watching Lone Ranger, you know, and hi-oh Silver and away, and all of a sudden Silver turns on and devours the Lone Ranger. You go, what just happened? That's the kind of shock that we're supposed to get when the beast devours the woman. Initially, they seem to be in relationship. They seem to be on the same team. But then the beast, this coalition of nations, turns on and devours. And so if Saudi is the harlot, then what that would say is that there is a conflict between these beast nations and the harlot, or Saudi Arabia, which means also that Saudi Arabia may not be part of the initial coalition of nations. Now, I speculate that the beast empire will be led by Turkey. It will be led by what I believe to be a conquered Iran. I believe that Iran will be conquered and that the Shia will be forced to sort of come under the leadership or under the, again, the hegemony of the Sunnis, as they have been down through history. The Shia have always sort of been that persecuted minority that have had to put up with the leadership of the Sunnis, and I believe there's some major wars coming, as detailed in Daniel 8, where Iran will be defeated by a larger emerging Turkish empire. Because right now, it really is. It's sort of the two-horned ram and the goat of Daniel 8. And it's the principality of Persia, the prince of Persia and the prince of Yavan. Now, we translate that in most translations as Greece. But there was no Greece when the prophecy was inspired. When Daniel 8 was given, there was no Greece.
That's right.
Yavan was Western Asia Minor. It was most of Asia Minor. And so throughout history, these principalities have been clashing. So you had Medo-Persia, Greece, then you had Rome and Parthia, Then you had the Sassanids and the Byzantines. Then you had the Safavids and the Ottomans. Today it's Iran and Turkey. And they're both trying to revive their empire. Today Iran controls Damascus, Beirut, and Baghdad. They almost have extended their empire all the way to the Mediterranean. Turkey's not too happy with that. They're both playing tug of war with the Kurds. And so I believe all of this with ISIS and this whole mess is going to lead to a regional conflict between Iran and Turkey. I believe that Turkey eventually conquers Iran. And this is the beginning of its consolidation of this 10-nation coalition. Eventually, Turkey will turn on, and of course, Iran will be thrilled to join in the destruction of Saudi Arabia.
Do you see Turkey as the king of the north then?
Yes. Yep.
So when Persia comes in to invade with that, Persia will be gobbled up after that is over, or how would that work out?
So essentially you have Daniel 8, which is the conflict between Persia and Yavan. And then you get to Daniel 11, and now it's the conflict between the king of the north and Egypt.
Yes.
Egypt is the other sort of dog in the fight. Egypt does not want to submit to Turkey. Turkey, by the way, the AKP party, led by President Erdogan, this is essentially the Turkish Muslim Brotherhood. That's why they were so upset when the Muslim Brotherhood got kicked out of Egypt.
Yes.
Right.
Erdogan was trying to sort of disciple Mohamed Morsi, who was the president of Egypt at the time, in terms of how to take over the country. Morsi was too aggressive. He tried to do it too fast. They threw a rebellion and threw him off.
Yeah, the army took over. And
so now Sisi and Erdogan have been butting heads ever since. And so that king of the north, king of the south, which is exactly the areas that it was historically, that geopolitical conflict is also coming into focus.
Do you think that the coup that took place in Turkey was a genuine coup, or was this just an excuse to crack down by Erdogan?
Well, if it was either a false flag, either a staged event, and there's been a handful of staged events in Turkey over the past 10 years. You had Ergenekon, you had these different claims to these efforts to attack the government. Erdogan used this, it was called Ergenekon. He used this to behead the military. He arrested over 300 military leaders in one night, put all of his own guys in place. But there were still some residual resistors. And really what the coup was it was a conflict between a group within Turkey known as Hizmet. Sometimes we call them the Gulenists. These are the disciples of Fethullah Gulen. He's the Islamist who lives very close to Langley in Pennsylvania.
That's right, in the Poconos,
He's the most wealthy Islamist in the world. His people had infiltrated the government. Erdogan rode their infiltration of the government to the top. Once he got to the top, very similar to Adolf Hitler, he turned on the brown shirts. And Erdogan essentially turned on the Gulenists.
Like the beast turning on the woman.
Exactly, that's what I was thinking when you said it.
Yeah. Very similar. So whether it was a legitimate coup or a controlled coup, either one, it's hard to know. You get little anecdotes, pointing to one or the other, but clearly Erdogan has used it to purge the entire country of all of his resistors, i.e. the Night of Long Knives, Adolf Hitler, where he, in really over a few nights, he killed, all of his previous supporters. And that's exactly what we're seeing in Turkey. But not only that, they're turning on the Christians, they're turning on the Kurds. They're using it to shut down all the journalism, media, and consolidate this dictatorship in Turkey. It is a nationalist, Islamist thing that's arising in Turkey right now that is a danger that the world has not seen in quite a long time.
Do you think it's coincidental that the churches in the book of Revelation, the letters written to them, they're all in Turkey?
Yeah, I don't believe in coincidences.
Neither do we.
Yeah.
But, it's interesting even beyond that. I mean, Jesus himself actually says of Pergamum, or Bergama today, I know where you live, where the throne of Satan is. Now, we could say that's historical. That was the temple
of Zeus.
Of Zeus, which is now in Berlin, which is not surprising that then Berlin becomes this capital of anti-Semitism and Hitler emerges. And actually, Turkey's suing Berlin right now to get that back. I think he's setting that as his goal, of course. He's now arranged things to where he will be in power at least until then. And so he's setting that as the goal for, I think, the complete consolidation of Turkish the revival, if you will, of this Turkish Ottoman Empire, Neo-Ottomanism, Yeni Osmanli, as they call it. Interestingly enough, in Iraq, right now. The Mosul offensive is still going on. And Turkey moved troops into northern Iraq. Well, northern Iraq is a different country. You know, this is not Turkey. Well, when Abadi, President Abadi of Iraq, said, we don't want your troops in our nation, he said, you should know your place. This is what Erdogan said to the president of another country. You should know your place. What, we don't have any say in what happens in our backyard? And he actually cited a map, which is from the period of 1923 when all these treaties were being made, in which much of northern Iraq and northern Syria was included as part of Turkey. He's already referring favorably to an expanded, a greater Turkey, if you will. And I think clearly this is what they're looking for. I was at a pro-government rally a couple years ago. It was the day after they purged all of the protesters out of Taksim Square. The day after, he gets up there and he gives a speech, and he is calling out the capitals of foreign countries. And he's saying, you know, Karachi. He's naming cities in the Balkans, and he's saying today is a day of victory for everyone. Now think about this. The night before, he purged some of his own protesters, his own political opponents, and he's calling this a victory for Karachi, a victory for Albania. It's this type of paternal language where he's presenting himself as the father of all of the Muslim world that is very concerning. I have a few reasons. I am a big believer in sort of the theories of Michael Heiser in terms of his descriptions of the principalities, the Elohim as they govern different parts of the world. And of course, Daniel, the book of Daniel, gives us some insight into the prince of Persia and the prince of Yavan. And so it's not a coincidence that historically Alexander the Great swept out of Macedonia, and then sort of under the spiritual authority, if you will, of the prince of Yavan, conquered much of the Middle East. And then out of that comes Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes becomes the greatest type or foreshadow of the Antichrist in all of Scripture. And he's in this part of the world. So there's that spiritual principle. That which took place in biblical history will be repeated in the last days. That's the pattern that Daniel establishes. There's also the simple reality that geography often determines the future of a nation. And so there's the spiritual, but then there's the natural. You know, the United States, why do we always tend to pull out of downturns, economic downturns? Because we have such an amazing piece of property. We have complete access to the Atlantic, to the Pacific. We have all these resources. We have all this space, et cetera, et cetera. Well, Turkey, likewise, Anatolia, Asia Minor, is one of the most amazingly strategic pieces of property in the whole Middle East. They sit there as a bridge between Europe and the Middle East, Asia. And they control so many energy pipelines and different things like that. And so you can explain it in the natural because of geography. But beyond the geography, I think there are deeper principalities that are at work, and those powers that are clashing throughout history will clash one final time until the ultimate principality, the God of gods, comes back and shatters and puts those principalities in the abyss forever. What's interesting when you look at Daniel 2's description of the final kingdom, of all of the different descriptions that were given, one of the specific descriptions is, it will be a divided kingdom. In that you saw the iron mixed with clay, but it will be a divided kingdom. And it's interesting that as soon as Muhammad died and there was this dispute broke out between those that thought the successorship should go to his family, they became known as the party of Ali, the Shia Ali, versus the Sunnis. And so Islam fulfills the biblical description to a T from the beginning. When we try to apply that to the Roman Empire, we go, well, there was this period where they were divided, but it really doesn't define the overarching history of the Roman Empire. And so it's interesting that one other criterion that we have in Daniel matches that of Islam. Again, the hand really tends to match the glove.
How do you think Russia enters into any of this?
Well, of course, Russia has its own geopolitical interests, primarily which are energy. You know, Russia's economy is largely hinges on energy. And so thus, right there in Syria, you have a few crisscrossing network of energy pipelines. And so that's exactly what Russia is doing. Russia is siding with Iran, with the Shia. largely against Turkey. Now, historically, Russia and Turkey have had all kinds of conflicts. Again, some of it because of geography.
Yeah.
If Russia wants to access the ocean, the sea, they can sort of peek out over there by the North Pole in China. You know, they can kind of creep up over there, or they can come down through the Bosphorus, but they need Turkey's
Crimean
permission.
War, they wanted to come in and take over the Ottoman Empire as it was starting to crumble.
Yep, yep.
Yep.
So it's history repeats itself, partially because of geography, partially because I believe of the principalities. That's why these things are constantly repeating.
It's really interesting. 2017, November of this year, is going to be the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, which changed everything in the Middle East. Again, the Ottoman Empire was starting to just fall apart, and a few years later, it was officially dead. Do you think that Erdogan will do anything this year to commemorate that, sort of kick off his move toward 2023?
That's a good question. Erdogan has, not only has he repeatedly presented himself in this paternalistic role over the whole Middle East, over all of the Muslims, but he's presented himself as the only party capable of moderating and mediating the conflict between the Palestinians and Israel. He recently even went so far as to say all Muslims are obligated to support the Palestinians in their defense of Jerusalem. He goes, we can no longer allow Jerusalem to be defended by little children with stones.
Yeah.
All Muslims are obligated to support them. So it's hard to say what he'll do this year. You know, I'm not a prophet or the son of a prophet, but I think looking at the pattern of his career, I think that he will clearly make a move with regard to Israel and insert himself centrally into that conflict.
Now, Israel and Turkey are officially reconciling after several years of conflict because of the Mavi Marmari incident, the Gaza flotilla, Freedom Flotilla. And
But Netanyahu has also been very good, very close friends lately with Putin. So
yeah. What is Erdogan's, what's the benefit to Erdogan with renewing ties or reestablishing ties with Israel?
You know, it's always just pure selfish benefit. You know, there's some economic benefits. There's possibly some economic and military benefits. But in the midst of this so-called reconciliation, he makes a statement saying all Muslims are obligated to defend Jerusalem. So, you know, when all that event happened and they said, look, we'll reconcile if Netanyahu will apologize. Netanyahu apologized. They put up billboards all over Turkey, where on one side of the billboard was Netanyahu crouching down, crying, begging, and up at top was Erdogan on the corner receiving forgiveness. And they mocked him with billboards, and then after he apologized, they still didn't accept the reconciliation. It's been a few more years. So I have zero trust, and I don't think Netanyahu's foolish enough to believe that it's a relational reconciliation. I think that events are leading to where it's going to force the hand of Iran. I think Iran is going to break out in a full-blown military excursion, not just through proxies as they're doing now, not just by sending in a small number of special forces or trained, you know, this sort of thing. I think there's going to be a full-scale military escalation in the Middle East, followed by a Turkish response. I don't know how much time will, you know, take place in between those two, but a Turkish response which will result in a greater Turkey. Now, this is the thing. I believe the Antichrist will come out of Turkey. I don't personally believe it's Erdogan, because I believe that once Turkey then conquers Iran, according to Daniel 8, it will break up into four. Now, a lot of people say, Joel, that's history. Well, read the words of Gabriel. He comes to Daniel and he goes, Daniel, I'm about to give you the interpretation of the vision. It concerns the time of the end. Daniel falls down, he picks him up, he goes, Daniel, I'm about to tell you about the final period of indignation. Listen to me because it concerns the time of the end. 3 times, 2 sentences, he says it's about the end times. If we take this consistent futurist interpretation, then that means that we'll see step 1, the Iranian invasion, step 2, the Turkish response, step 3, out of the 4 as it breaks up, comes the Antichrist. So the Antichrist, I believe, will come out of Turkey, but it might be a different Turkey than we see today. It could be out of the area today that's Syria or Iraq. But I think Turkey, the borderlines will change. They're already changing. Syria and Iraq don't exist anymore.
That's true. So will this end up being World War III, essentially? Because Russia will become involved if Iran goes in and Turkey goes against Iran.
Yeah, very
and we'll
well.
eventually become involved
Yeah, I think that's the idea. Is if all the Middle Eastern nations are fighting, it's bad. If Russia and the United States is involved, World War III.
Yeah.
And I think that we'll be forced to take a side. And here's the difficulty: is that all evidence points to the fact that the United States will continue its pattern of siding with Turkey, including under Trump. But the truth is, if I was in charge, I would actually side with the Shia. I would side with Iran, because between all of this, in terms of really what's unfolding, I think long term, the far greater danger is the Sunnis, is Turkey. And unfortunately, we don't have the foresight. American foreign policy doesn't often have the foresight. We're looking at tomorrow, we fund the Taliban to fight against the Soviets. Next thing you know, we're fighting the Taliban, et cetera, et cetera. And so in this case, I think we need a little bit more foresight.
Yeah, there's a key difference between the Sunnis and the Shias in the way they view end times prophecy. The Sunnis believe that they can kickstart the apocalypse, whereas the Shias believe there's nothing that you can do to bring on the end times. In fact, they're not even supposed to try. It's waiting when the 12th Imam appears for 12 or Shia, that he's going to lead them to victorious global jihad. But the Shias, especially radical, really the hardcore groups like the Islamic State, believe that, they can bring it on.